June of 1633. In the Grand Hall of the Convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Galileo Galilei, a mathematician, an astronomer, and an inventor, stood before the Roman Inquisition. At 69 years old, his health failing, he'd faced judgment for teaching something the Church had declared unacceptable, that the Earth moves around the sun. For nearly 2 decades, Galileo had used his telescope to explore the heavens, discovering moons orbiting Jupiter, charting the phases of Venus, and mapping the rugged surface of the moon. These observations challenged the geocentric model, which placed Earth at the center of the universe, a model the Church had defended for centuries. The Catholic Church had warned him in 1616 not to present heliocentrism as a fact, but Galileo believed the evidence was too strong to ignore. When he published Dialogue Concerning Two Chief World Systems in 1632, presenting both the heliocentric and geocentric models, it was obvious which he believed to be true. The Inquisition summoned him to answer for it. After a formal trial, Galileo was found vehemently suspected of heresy. He was ordered to publicly recant his support for heliocentrism and sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. His book was banned, his public voice was silenced. Yet his ideas couldn't contain. They escaped and spread quietly across Europe, fueling the scientific revolution. Over the next century, the heliocentric model became the accepted foundation of modern astronomy. Galileo's story is not just about science, it's about the courage of one individual to follow evidence and his conscience against the demands of the most powerful institution of his age. Libertarians embrace individualism because it puts the person and not the government or society at the center of political decisions, ensuring respect for personal freedom and choice. And in this episode, we're going to explore what individualism means, where it came from, how it differs from collectivism, and why it's central to a free society. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. Thanks so much for joining me here on this episode. We're talking about something that I think is really important and speaks into this moment of time, and it is individualism versus collectivism. This is a core principle of libertarianism, and it is the unit by which we judge society and do our analysis when we're looking at the news. It's through the lens of individualism and not collectivism, right? So we'll get into what that means. If you're not sure, maybe you have an idea, right? But let's get into it. So let's kind of jump back and talk about the evolution of the idea of individualism. For most of human history, people didn't see themselves as independent agents. This is what Glenn Scrivener calls the air we breathe, right? We just take for granted that individualism is something that we all, it's the lens that we look through, right? It's the worldview that everybody thinks of themselves as an individual participating in a family and a society, but it hasn't been that way for most of human history. Identity was rooted in tribe, and their clan, and their village, or maybe a class. For instance, in medieval Europe, you were first a member of your family and a social station, like a peasant or a knight or a merchant, and not an autonomous individual making decisions for yourself. Your worth came from your role in that hierarchy, and your duty was to your community and your obedience to its customs. And I just think that's a completely foreign way of thinking here in America because we beat them in 1776. Psychologists call this the interdependent self. Your decisions weren't just yours because every decision that you made would impact the social status of your nuclear and extended family. And your behavior was measured by the expectations of your family, your church, your neighbors, and local ruling powers. And so there were some strengths to this collectivist worldview, and it was stability, belonging, a clear moral framework, right? People were able to tell you how to live, where to live. You weren't going out and trying to construct your own moral framework every 5 minutes and changing and having all this wrestling that we see so much in culture today. But it had a lot of drawbacks. It had little room for dissent, slow adoption of new ideas, and the suppression of personal conscience when it conflicted with tradition. So if you saw something that was wrong, you really couldn't speak out. So we're going to, in this episode, talk about the history of individualism, a few types of it, and some critiques and plus and minuses of it, let's say. So let's start with the development of individualism. How do we move from, think of Braveheart and those Scottish clans in the Highlands, or the New Guinea indigenous tribes that, National Geographic in 1960 are going and photographing, or Incan communities, right? How did we go from a clan-based society to an industrial society like we live in today? What are some of the highlights? So let's give you some of the highlights and how we got to that point. One flashpoint was in 399 BC when Socrates stood before the Athenian jury and refused to give up his search for truth, even at the cost of his life. They killed Socrates because he was annoying and wouldn't touch kids. Look it up. That's the truth. The Stoic philosophers later argued that reason and moral worth exist in every human being, regardless of status. So, embedded in ancient Grecian culture is the idea of individualism, starting with Socrates and then filtering through those philosophers. Christian contributions also cannot be understated. Christianity introduced a radical spiritual equality. All people are made in the image of God, and breaks down those hierarchies, the Imago Dei, and they're personally accountable to God and their conscience, right? Salvation was personal. Each stood before God in judgment. So you and your family are not going to stand in front of God. The Christian conception of individualism is that you alone will stand before God, and you must answer for your sins, and that's why Jesus saved us from them. So the Protestant Reformation took that even further. Martin Luther declared the priesthood of all believers, quote unquote, teaching that every Christian could read and interpret the scripture without a priest as a mediator. And conscience became a personal responsibility for God. In time, Protestant work ethic ideas, especially the concept of a personal calling, fostered a sense of self-reliance and purpose in work. Catholic thought also developed personalism, teaching that each person has an intrinsic dignity and must never be treated merely as a means to an end. So that idea that you can wake up in the morning and follow your passion every day has its roots in Protestantism. I can't say it. You know what I mean. And then, personalism takes that and says that you're not just a cog in a machine. You don't exist to go out and get a paycheck and then die. You are a human being worth so much more than that, right? You're not just like a robot, right? So then we move on to the Enlightenment, okay? The Enlightenment has people like John Locke, who argued that life, liberty, and property are natural rights and that the government exists to protect them, not grant them. We covered that in detail in the previous episode. Go check that out. And John Stuart Mill defended individuality in thought and belief as essential to human progress. So then we move on to the Romanticism and Transcendentalism period. And you have thinkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau in the 1800s, urging people to trust their inner moral compass and resist conformity and live deliberately. And so by the time and then you also have the American founding. So by the time America's founded, individualism is just embedded in the DNA of America between the Judeo-Christian traditions that I talked about and the Enlightenment traditions, which is funny because the Enlightenment and Romanticism in some ways are a rejection of those Judeo-Christian conformities. But it all comes together in the American idea that every individual is is made in the image of God, therefore worth liberty and dignity and justice, and afforded liberty, dignity, and justice. Excuse me. I've had a lot of caffeine today, so I'm talking very fast, so I apologize. But you see this notion of individualism, of self-government, of you choosing your path in your life and not having an outside church, government, family structure telling you how you can and can't live, at least not embedded in law. And you see that in the Bill of Rights, through the freedom of religion that Thomas Jefferson writes out, and the idea that government exists to secure the liberties of each person, not to provide you things, but to secure your liberty. Again, going back to negative and positive rights, which we talked about in that last episode. So let's talk about ethical individualism. Okay, what is this concept? Ethical individualism is the belief that each person has the right and the responsibility to chart their own course in life as long as you respect the rights of others, which is key. And so what does that mean, right? Because in this day and age, words are violence, and if I hurt your feelings, then I'm not respecting you. But that's not what we mean when we say respect the rights of others. What we mean is that you are not, like in the last episode, taking people's life, liberty, property. You're not stealing from them. You are not defrauding them. You are not killing them. Those are the rights that you must respect, right? You can chart your own course and hurt your mom's feelings, and you have a right to do so because you didn't physically hurt her or steal her property. But it's all about making your own choices and accepting the consequences of those choices. We've seen recently, I'm trying to make these as evergreen and as timeless as possible, but we've seen recently a president use the FCC to go after late night comedians, right? If let's say Jimmy Kimmel on ABC, and ABC doesn't like what Jimmy Kimmel is saying, they have every right to fire Jimmy Kimmel. It is a voluntary contract between those two. They have a contract, I'm sure. Whatever is in the contract may be fired for cause because he said something inappropriate. ABC has every right to do that because everybody has a right to voluntary association. But the government can't come in and force consequences because then that starts to step into freedom of speech and detangling society from the ability to freely associate or not. Maybe Disney wants Jimmy Kimmel on the air saying whatever they want. Maybe, probably not, but that's just like an example of how you're free to make your own choices and accept the consequences. You can say whatever you want. The government allows you to say whatever you want. And if the government doesn't allow you to say whatever you want, then that's a problem, right? So, but you also accept the consequences of your words. Libertarians believe in this kind of freedom because it encourages responsibility. Personal responsibility, when I was coming up in the conservative and libertarian circles, was like the go-to. People talked about it all the time. Ayn Rand, Ronald Reagan, Rush Limbaugh, personal responsibility in the 90s and 2000s, and George W. Bush. It's all we talked, personal responsibility. Seems to have gone out of fashion to talk about personal responsibility. It seems like we're saying it's the left's fault or the right's fault, and we now have collectivized groups that we can blame for our own failures. That's not what I believe, and we'll talk a little bit about that collectivization next, but we believe in personal responsibility because if you're free to choose your education, career, or medical care, you also bear the cost if it fails, and you enjoy the rewards if it succeeds. You have to be able to get the full benefits or consequences of any decision you make, and if you have that responsibility, you're going to make better decisions. You're going to make more informed decisions. You're going to have better services because you're directly involved in making those decisions. Car insurance is a lot better than health insurance because there's a lot less regulation and a lot more ability to make better choices. In an ethical individualist society, you're not expected to depend on the state to make your life decisions. Instead, you're encouraged to be self-reliant while still free to join communities and causes voluntarily. Again, libertarianism is all about it's about voluntary, right? Libertarianism is not cultural in the way that conservatism and progressivism try to be cultural. Libertarians' main proposition is should the government have the power to do something? And the answer in libertarianism is usually no. But it is not, should this group or that group do that to this group, right? It is that is a function of our society, which is why libertarianism has fallen out of fashion with so many people, is because they want to use cultural and political power to do what they want to do instead of just saying, we wash our hands of cultural power and let's just focus on the monopolization of violence within the government and its impact on individuals. So let me give an example of an ethical individualist society, right? I mean, you see it all the time. You should have the freedom to choose your own education or healthcare without heavy government mandates or restrictions. But I'd also say, like, a modern challenge is, in the age of social media, conformity can come not from the government, but from online mobs. The pressure to think and speak a certain way tests whether we truly value the freedom of conscience we claim to defend. When you look at the freedom of speech examples that happen so often, individuals are free to make the decision on their own vaccination status, and a business can say, I don't want to associate with you or not. But at the same time, like, what's the real risk of that, right? A late night comedian can be fired for freedom of speech. They have the ability to disassociate with that person, but should they, right? Is that a precedent that we want to set? We are doing a lot of things to please mobs online on all sides. And instead of thinking about the consequences, I wouldn't say the consequences, the permission structure that is being built around that, right? You have to stop and step back as an individual and say, is this the world that I want to live in? Is this the world I want my kids to grow up in? Do I want my kids to live in a world where something they tweet at 16 will get them fired at 38? Most people think, no, that's crazy. We shouldn't build that permission structure. We should give grace and say, you were 16 and you said something dumb. You know, maybe there's a different tolerance for somebody who is 48 and saying something currently that an employer or a group of people online don't like. But at the end of the day, I tend to, like, say, look, okay, I want more speech. I want more awareness, because then I know your values and you and I can argue about those values and shape and change each other's ideas. And maybe you'll see it my way and maybe I won't, but we're going to step into the conversation and have it and fight it out and see where we can find common ground and where we can't. And if we can't on some big issues, like, do you think immigrants are humans? Then I guess we can't be connected, right? Like, if you're a racist, it's really hard to be in community with people that are Black or Hispanic, because you're denying their dignity, their fundamental right to live, and altering it in a way that's a right to live, right? So, but I err on the side of more speech and not allowing online mobs to go in and try to shape society in its image, because cancel culture on left and right, it's not working for us. It's too insane, right? So I look at it from a position of principle and not which team am I on, right? Because I've seen a lot of people say, well, I'm on the side of the comedian, but they weren't on the side of Alex Jones. You know, you like, to be consistent, you really kind of have to be on the side of Alex Jones and Jimmy Kimmel. Like, the government can't jawbone Facebook and Twitter to get rid of Alex Jones from 14 social media platforms in 24 hours. And the government can't also tell ABC that it has to let Jimmy Kimmel go, right? Like, that's the consistent principle. But if you're trying to find justifications to virtue signal to your team and say, I'm with you, as opposed to the principle, well, then you're not an individualist, right? Individualists look at principles and examine things from that point of view how does the principle apply in this situation versus what can I say that will make my team happy so they know I'm on their side? And I think that's a lot of what's going on. So political individualism applies these ideas of, social interactions to government. And so from the libertarian perspective, the state's proper role is to protect individual rights like life, liberty, and property, but not to dictate how people live or to force them into collective goals. So this means opposing overreach, whether it's mandatory military service, censorship of unpopular ideas, or regulations that strangle small business. So let me give you a case example. West Virginia versus Barnett in 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that students could not be forced to salute the flag or say the Pledge of Allegiance. Justice Robert Jackson wrote, quote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or matters of opinion." Right? So, you see a lot of government officials these days saying you can't burn a flag, that you have to say the Pledge of Allegiance. That's forced patriotism. That's not allowing the individual to express their love or disdain of country. Whether you love or disdain this country, that does not matter to the government. The government should just exist to protect your life, liberty, and property. It shouldn't pass laws to force people to love it. That is collectivism in the name of nationalism. That is not individualism. It's un-American. Libertarians also oppose the military draft, which forces individuals into actions against their will, violating personal autonomy. So, you are not property of the state. The state cannot force you to go to war because it has decided to go to war, especially if it is against your belief system. Because you are a part of the nation, you are not owned by it. So let's jump into individualism versus collectivism and kind of narrow down on this. Understanding collectivism, collectivism, like typically what you get is like communists, right? Communists, socialists, they're really into collectivism. That's political collectivism, right? We are all property of the state. But I would say white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, these are forms of collectivism too, where you are taking a group of people and applying a broad brush to them, assigning all members of that identity traits, and then trying to craft policy for those different groups. So collectivism places group goals above individual rights. Leaders or majorities decide what benefits the whole, and individual freedoms can be restricted to serve that vision. And this is a question that I think you have to ask yourself a lot when you're watching the news. How much political force should be used to make me participate in your vision of the world and vice versa? I'm a Christian. Make no bones about it. I'm different than a Christian nationalist. I'm a Christian libertarian, which means that I don't want the state to do anything other than make sure that there is justice and safety and have as few wars as possible, leave charity and everything up to persons to decide, right? But you have to have some monopolized force around things like justice and courts and possibly policing, probably policing. I'm for a robust city and somewhat robust states, right? I like sidewalks. I like roads. There are some zoning codes I don't have a problem with. Sorry, libertarians. I've been to Atlanta where there are no zoning codes, and it's a mess. But I also don't want to live in one of these suburban zoning code factories, right? All right, I'm on a tangent, right? I want more power at the smallest, closest unit of government to the individual as possible. I think we see as the power at the federal level has expanded how much more divisive that has gotten, how much less control voters have over their government, how much more perilous voting has become, because if we centralize voting machines at the federal level, That's all she wrote. Left, right, center, whatever. It should be decentralized in 3,000 different counties. So, but how much force do you want to use to make other people live out your worldview? How much should I be forced to participate in your worldview, right? As a Christian, I just don't think I can convert you or force you to live out my vision of life by using public policy. I think you resent me if I do that. And I don't want you to resent me. I want you to love Jesus and have a relationship with him, not focus on how much you hate me for wanting to control you. So I think it's counterintuitive. Again, violence always backfires, right? What you see happening with Charlie Kirk is violence was used against Charlie Kirk because of his speech. And now I literally see people trying to put him up for canonization at the Catholic Church. His producer called him Moses. They're making a coin out of him. Like, we have 1 million Charlie Kirks now because violence was used against Charlie Kirk. And so the same can be said about politics, right? If you are using government to force people to live out your vision, that backlash comes in and it actually causes, it's counter to what your actual goals were. Socialist or communist systems where resources, property, and decisions are controlled or heavily influenced by government authorities for the good of society is one example of collectivism. And think about those systems. They often restrict speech, belief, and economic freedoms in the name of conformity and equality. Let's look at Hong Kong. An example from our own day and age. For 100 years, Britain controlled Hong Kong with Western values of individualism, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and free markets. And Hong Kong was one of the freest places in the world to live, to do business, to have any kind of speech. Remember when Edward Snowden was fleeing from the government, the Obama government in 2014, I believe? Where did he go? He went to Hong Kong to figure out his next step because it was so free. But at 100 years, the government took control, the Chinese government, the British government gave back control of Hong Kong to the Chinese. They had like a 100-year lease on it. It's no longer free markets, no longer free speech. We've watched, if you've been paying attention, we've watched the complete destruction of free thought, free expression, free markets take place in Hong Kong in the last 10 years because communism has come in and destroyed individualism and imposed collectivism on it. So that's why I prefer individualism, right? So when group goals overshadow individual rights, people lose the ability to control their own lives and destinies. A society that values individualism encourages creativity, entrepreneurship, and personal growth. Are you against creativity, entrepreneurship, and personal growth? I don't think so. Well, you've got to have individualism to make that happen. Freedom allows diverse ideas and approaches to flourish. We learn from each other. We sharpen each other based on our collaborations, and it improves society through voluntary cooperation rather than forced conformity. Is health insurance better since the government instituted Obamacare? Or are your premiums going up 20% every single year? The less choice, the less freedom that you have, the worse the service will get, the more expensive it gets. So let's contrast these two societies, right? Individualist societies prioritize free speech, religious liberty, and economic choice, allowing for innovation and diversity. And collectivist systems often restrict speech, beliefs, and economic freedoms in pursuit of conformity and control, leading to stagnation and the loss of liberty. So I am on the exact opposite side of anybody that wants to centralize control and compel individuals to live out collective goals, collective visions. I'm against you. So some people, you're woke, you're a leftist, you're a white nationalist, right? It depends on your world. I get called all kinds of different things. What I really want is for you to be left alone, and for you to leave other people alone, and for you to sit down and write in a journal and say, here's what I want my life to look like, and then have the freedom to do that without other people coming in and forcing you to live the way that they want you to live. So I want to get into Christian critiques of individualism and kind of, because I see this from the right now. The Christian right has started to take aim at individualism and libertarians. And I think the goal is that they want to impose a more collectivist vision on society. And you have to get rid of moderates. Because if you are an extreme person on whatever side, you hate the moderates within your own camp more than you hate the people on the other side. They oppose you because you're a Republican, they're a Democrat. We all oppose each other. But like, look at how much libertarians hate other libertarians, right? Those are the more personal fights, right? We can get along with Republicans and Democrats, but man, screw that libertarian, right? But I think the reason that you see a lot of the more collectivist, right-leaning people taking aim at individualism and Christians and libertarians who are more in line with the individualism versus collectivism is that you've got to get rid of the example. Because if the conscience is there, then people can look at the conscience of, hey, this is what, hey, Chris Spangle says that you have permission to be an individual. You have a right to life, liberty, and property. Well, we've got to get rid of that guy because he is not showing you the proper vision of what needs to be imposed. It's a function of whenever you see one of these right-leaning people taking aim at classic American foundational principles, it's because they want to destroy those principles. They're not critiquing, they're trying to do exactly what you heard. Restrict speech, beliefs, and economic freedoms in pursuit of conformity and control, which leads to stagnation and loss of liberty. So I'm going to be opposed to you, but I do want to share some of these critiques of individualism, right? So Christians and a lot of these folks will warn against expressive individualism, the idea that self-expression is the highest goal, often at the expense of God or community. They caution that radical independence can lead to isolation, undermine unity in the church and shared moral purpose. Affirm that while individuals have immense worth, they are designed to live as part of a body using their gifts or service. Just to kind of dig into some of this, expressive individualism versus a God-centered identity. Many Christian thinkers challenge expressive individualism, the idea that personal fulfillment and self-expression are primary. They argue instead for a God-centered life where true identity comes through belonging to something larger than ourselves. My identity is based in Christ. That is where my moral framework comes from. I think that if you were trying to construct other identities, you're out of touch with the way that you were created, and it will collapse in on the weight of itself. That's my belief, right? I think you should have every right to go and test that theory out. So I would say that I kind of agree with this one, but at the end of the day, like, the function of having a libertarian society is what you would call pluralism, right? Because libertarianism leaves so much to voluntary association or civil society to cure social ills, it kind of steps out of the culture war and says our primary concern is the proper role of government's power in your life, and we're kind of declaring a truce on culture. And so because I hold the belief that individuals are best when they have their identity in Christ, I'm not going to pass a law to force you to live that way, right? I'm going to allow you to go out. I mean, because you heard my story in the last podcast, like, I didn't always live that way. I should have the freedom to go out and make the mistakes I've made because it eventually makes me a better person, right? And so pluralism, it's functionally creates pluralism where you have a lot of different ideas and identities and belief systems all coexisting and working together on the problems where they want to connect, and agreeing to disagree and disengaging on the points that they disagree. It's not two sides fighting for the barrel of the gun, because if I'm a Republican and the Democrats win, they're going to kill me. So I've got to get rid of all of this liberty BS to protect my whole life, because they're going to murder me if I don't get control of the gun. It's a sick and twisted worldview, to be honest with you, because once you get out in the world and you just accept that pluralism it's either pluralism or war. You don't have a choice. You either have to coexist with people that have different beliefs, religions, identities than you, or you will perish as a country, as a nation. So when individualism becomes radical, rejecting all communal bonds, like living out in the forest, it erodes relational identity. Critics warn this leads to a form of loneliness alien to Christian community, which emphasizes mutual belonging and shared purpose. I agree with this, but I also think this is a little bit overstated, right? Like, we can't have individualism because people end up lonely, because they isolate themselves. My guilty pleasure is Homestead Rescue with Marty Rainey. And inevitably, they do like recap shows, and they go back, and these people who like move out to the country and cut themselves off, they eventually move back, or they find community in where they're at. Like, we're just communal beings. And I think if somebody were to move out in a Ted Kaczynski cabin, they wouldn't stay there long. I just think that's an overwrought position. An overly individualistic faith, My Bible and Me, has fragmented Christianity globally, resulting in thousands of denominations and undermining communal unity. Christianity emphasizes the body of Christ, not isolated selves. Yeah, that's kind of a tension between Catholicism / Orthodox and Protestants. I want to show unity in what I have to say. I am a Presbyterian in a small Presbyterian branch, right? And I think, I don't know, if the Catholic Church had not misbehaved for so long, we wouldn't, if they hadn't been lusting after worldly power instead of godly power, then we wouldn't be in this situation. I think you tend to find community with Christians of different denominations if you try, and you may not worship with them on Sunday, but if you go out in your community and you're working on shared projects, like at Shepherd Community Center here in Indianapolis, there's people from all kinds of denominations working on godly pursuits together. I just don't see the level of division and anger acted out in the very Christian circles that I work in and live in here in Indianapolis, that is cross-denominational, that I often see expressed on social media by people who are trying to get you into Orthodoxy or Catholicism. So I just don't buy it. I think saying there's a million different denominations is just sort of, it's like a thing people say, but that's because they want you to join their team. Theologians like C.S. Lewis argue that Christianity values individuals, not isolated atoms, but as essential parts of a larger body. So each, I wrote this poorly. Theologians like C.S. Lewis argue that Christianity values individuals not as isolated atoms, but as essential parts of a larger body, each person offering unique gifts for communal flourishing. Moreover, Christianity offers theological roots for individualism grounded in sin and redemption. The individual must stand alone in repentance and faith, but it is called to holiness within community. And I think, as usual, C.S. Lewis gets it right. You are called to, as I have talked about on the show before, you are called to focus on your personal life. You need to focus on your physical life, your spiritual life, your mental and emotional life. You need to focus on your vocation, right? You have to get your ducks in a row, and then you have to work within your family unit to make sure that is healthy. And then, then you go out into the community, right? But there's just to say that, to make this a binary choice of individualism means that you are alone is just not the truth. If you think back to the beginning of this episode, we're talking a lot about voluntary cooperation. Like, individualism is not isolation. Individualism is working together with a lot of different people that you don't always agree with, to achieve certain goals because you have agreed that you're not going to use violence to solve the problem. Collectivism uses violence to force you into groups and then never solves the problem. So it's not isolation. It is working within small communities to solve big problems. So just to wrap it up here, the journey from collectivist societies, which is really what most of history has known. Like, the reason the American founding 250 years ago was so radical is that it was created around the idea of individualism and not collectivism. You didn't exist within a patrimonial system where there was the head of a clan and then he was giving the wealth to his friends. What's the saying that Jonah Goldberg always talks about? For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law. Right? That is the existing condition of most of humans for most of society. And you see countries around the world now going from Western ways of thinking, which at the core of is individualism, towards more collectivist ideas, all to enrich the dear leader. But that's because that, I think, is the natural state. And this is what Jonah Goldberg argues in his book. What is it called? It's really, really good. He calls it the miracle. Let me look this up. Jonah Goldberg book, Suicide of the West. And he argues that, like, patrimonialism, hierarchy, maybe not socialism, but like this idea of clan rule is the default state of human nature. And so to have individualism, to think independently of an identity or a group, is inherently, it goes against human nature, which is why it's so difficult. But we fought long and hard to get to this point, to allow people to make decisions to how they want to govern their life. Christianity helped shape it by affirming personal dignity and conscience, even as it continues to warn against individualism detached from community. Libertarians embrace individualism because it protects conscience, encourages responsibility, and fuels human creativity. I keep mentioning the word conscience, and let me explain that, because change starts when your conscience is pricked, and you hear it, and you go, this isn't right. This needs to change. That is the beginning of change. I feel guilty. I feel shame around this. I feel empathy for that person. It's your conscience that is really a guide when it comes to how to act out your values as an individual. Libertarians embrace it because it protects conscience, encourages responsibility, and fuels human creativity. But the healthiest form is grounded in virtue and balanced by voluntary cooperation. Galileo's defiance in 1633 reminds us progress begins when individuals have the courage to follow truth over authority. Protecting that freedom is at the heart of what it means to live in a free society. So I hopefully that helps you understand individualism a little bit more. I sometimes feel like these little, even though I have written my outline, I feel like that makes it even more of a mess. I don't know why. But I just, I've been thinking a lot about individualism in kind of the way that things are happening in the news cycle and how important they are, and how important it is to kind of stand as an individual by understanding your values, understanding your principles, understanding these foundational principles of what makes a free society and what makes a healthy society, and having the courage to stand opposite your group when they inevitably cross the line. Like, if you are, like, I don't want to, I'll pick on both sides of free speech. Like, how many times am I, like, the Dixie Chicks? Okay, here's the example. The Dixie Chicks. Don't like the Dixie Chicks because that Earl song was, like, I grew up loving Eminem, and I just remember how much flack he took for all the, fake songs about killing his ex-wife, how awful it was, and how could our kids listen to this? And in the same exact time, this song Earl that the Dixie Chicks had was the same exact premise. And then everybody played it on the radio and loved it. And I'm just like, that seems hypocritical. But the Dixie Chicks get canceled in, like, I don't know, 2003 or 4. They go out of country to a concert. They criticize George W. Bush and the Iraq War effort, and they get canceled. Like, they get all these tours canceled, and the media's like, how awful are they? Blah, blah. I just remember thinking, like, I don't agree with them, but maybe we're overreacting a little bit to this. That was like my first cancellation. Okay, now I've been through this a million times. This ain't my first rodeo with cancellations. And so they're liberal and they're in country music, but they're kind of liberal leaning, and so they pay for that because they didn't say what their in-group wanted to hear. And, they kind of fell out of the charts and kind of, and then start to come back. And then we sort of move from like a conservative leaning area to a liberal leaning area. And now the Dixie Chicks get canceled because they have Dixie in the name. And now they're just called the Chicks. And the other side gets rid of them. Because how could you be so racist and hateful by having Dixie in your name? I'm just hoping now we get like now that we're going back to a conservative culture, that they get canceled again for that stupid Earl song. That's what I'm arguing for. But like, it just shows you that it's just back and forth. Like, people who were arguing against COVID-era censorship are now arguing for Jimmy Kimmel to get canceled. You have people who are free speech warriors who were like, let's get rid of Alex Jones. It's just stupid. Like, it drives me crazy. And the only way to not go crazy is to understand the value of free speech and why it's important and hold fast to the principle. And even if you're a right-leaning person speaking up and saying, yeah, Jimmy Kimmel, look, I think Jimmy Kimmel has his funny moments. I don't watch him anymore. But the monologue he gave, the first monologue he gave back that Tuesday night was fantastic. He said, I mean, people clearly didn't listen to what he said because they have all kinds of perception about it. It's like, you guys are the ones who said, no, you're getting Charlie Kirk wrong, just listen to him, but now I'm going to get Jimmy Kimmel wrong, and don't call me out on it. I had an argument with a guy. I just got to start arguing on Facebook. But my larger point, to bring it all back, right? It's just, I have followed politics for 25, 30 years now. I've been involved in political media for 20. It's never not going to go back and forth. It's always going to be tribal. It's always going to get team-based. It's only going to get worse the higher the stakes, the higher that we pretend the stakes are. And you're going to feel like you have to choose. You don't have to choose a side. If nobody has told you that, I'm telling you that. Because you're an individual with your own mind, your own values, your own beliefs, your own history as to why you think those things. And yes, it is painful to feel a part of an identity group and yet have conflicting ideas with the majority of the people in that group. That's just part of the brokenness of the world, is that we aren't all united together. We don't have harmony and peace. It's a broken and fractured world, and that is terrible and awful, and I'm sorry for it. You don't have to contribute to it with tribalism and partisanship and give up your individual thoughts and beliefs and stay quiet because you feel like you have to belong. So much of politics and social media today now is like joining a gang for protection because, well, I'm eventually going to say the wrong thing because everybody says the wrong thing because there's no standard. It's just mob justice. So at least if I'm with these guys, they'll have my back when I do the wrong thing. And then you just get a permission structure in your mind that you can start doing the wrong things and saying the wrong things. And, well, it doesn't matter because my boys are with me. That's not individualism. That's collectivism. That's crazy. So be an individual. Embrace individualism. Take from, like the Christian conception, right, is get into your Bible. Read what God has to say. Don't people please. The Bible repeatedly warns against people pleasing and pleasing men. And once you do that, you've given up truth. You have stopped adhering to what Christ says. Christ loses his power because you're trying to please other people. And so often the discourse is that if you're a conservative and you're trying to say something progressive, it's because you're a coward and you're not with us and you're not people pleasing. I'm calling BS on that, because to me, the ultimate cowardice is just saying whatever the group wants you to say. It is weakness. It is outsourcing your own beliefs and thoughts to other people. And that's that's one reason my faith has been so strengthened in the last few years, is because I just turn to Jesus, try to figure out what he wants, what he says, how he treated people. What he cared about is what I want my politics to care about. How he talked to people is how I want my politics to be. He had Simon the Zealot and he had Matthew the tax collector together on the same team, working towards making disciples of all the nation. Simon the Zealot hated Rome, hated the Roman government, probably participated in acts of violence against the government. What do you think he thought of Matthew the tax collector for the Romans, who was betraying his own people in their view? How were the first few conversations between those two? But they had to come together, give up their collective identities, come together, and Jesus put them together and forced them into community and find common ground, find the dignity of the other individual, and find reasons to love each other. So it's possible. We have the model on how to do it. But yeah, I would just call you to have courage. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't talk to somebody. I talk to so many Republicans that are scared to say what they want to say. They know it's a clown show. They know it's ridiculous, but they're worried for their business. They're worried for their political careers. They're worried for their personal careers, that if they speak up and say what a clown show this is, that they're going to suffer the consequences. Well, you're giving into collectivism. You're being a coward. It's anytime you attach your identity so closely to a collective group and you give up individualism in your own mind, you are in peril. All right, thanks for joining me here on the Chris Spangle Show. I really appreciate it. If you got something out of this, I hope you share it. We've had a bunch of people download these shows, so I've had a bunch of messages. If you've written me, I've read your message. I would thank you for your message. I will share those on future shows. Haven't had time to respond to anyone, unfortunately. Just trying to get the time to do these. But I truly appreciate your notes, and thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you again here on the Chris Spangle Show.